Cześć, to Kuba Pawlak i kolejny odcinek Race podcasty o bieganiu. W tym odcinku gościmy legendę świata nauki o sporcie. Nie zawaham się użyć takiego sformułowania. Legendę, której nazwisko stało się synonimem nowoczesnego podejścia do wytrzymałości na całym świecie. Profesor Stephen Seiler, bo o nim mowa, jest twórcą koncepcji treningu spolaryzowanego oraz słynnej Piramidy potrzeb, o której tutaj taki chichot losu rozmawialiśmy z Jackiem Tyczyńskim w pierwszym wspólnym odcinku w tym podcaście, w dniu, w którym tak naprawdę poznaliśmy się dopiero osobiście, także życie zatoczyło takie ładne koło. No i wspólnie z Jackiem dzisiaj postanowiliśmy dowiedzieć się, czy po latach badań profesor zmieniłby jakkolwiek kolejność stopni w swojej piramidzie. Dlaczego na przykład treningu siłowego nie ma w jej fundamentach, o którym tyle się przecież mówi, oraz czy amator trenujący 6 godzin tygodniowo powinien przejmować się zasadą 80/20, zasadą takiego podziału intensywności w treningu, tak samo jak elita biegania. Słuchając tego podcastu dowiecie się oczywiście też dużo więcej, ale uprzedzam, że rozmowa odbywa się w języku angielskim. Z naszej strony zdecydowanie nieperfekcyjnym, ale jednak angielskim, więc wiedząc, że zależy Wam na merytoryce, przygotowaliśmy też pewne ułatwienie. Jeżeli nie czujecie się na siłach, by słuchać oryginału lub po prostu chcecie wrócić do konkretnych fragmentów, to teraz już na naszej stronie RacePace czeka na Was uproszczona transkrypcja tego wywiadu w języku polskim. Znajdziecie tam oczywiście najważniejsze wątki przełożone na taki bardziej przystępny język. Tę rozmowę mieliśmy przyjemność zarejestrować też w wyjątkowych okolicznościach, o czym warto tu wspomnieć, bo spotkaliśmy się z profesorem podczas konferencji Next Generation Performance, której jako RacePace mieliśmy zaszczyt być partnerem. To było naprawdę niesamowite wydarzenie skupiające topowych ekspertów i trenerów z Polski i z zagranicy. No i nasza dzisiejsza publikacja to również owoc tych inspirujących bardzo spotkań. Więc zanim oddam głos profesorowi, chciałbym przypomnieć tylko, że partnerem wszystkich naszych odcinków w tym miesiącu jest też Bimor 5K, czyli prawdopodobnie najszybsza wiosenna piątka w Warszawie. Jeżeli jeszcze nie macie planów startowych, no to dobra wiadomość jest taka, że właśnie trwają zapisy. Nie zwlekajcie, bo miejsca rozchodzą się w tempie godnym właśnie życiówki na piątkę. No a teraz zapraszam Was na takie głębokie nurkowanie w fizjologię, w strategię i filozofię w ogóle treningu. Przed Wami, moi drodzy, człowiek, który o treningu biegowym wie chyba wszystko, profesor Stephen Seiler. Miłego odbioru.
Dr. Seiler, thank you for joining us on RacePace podcast. It's a great honor to us because your name is really familiar for our audience and for us. And this is also a special conversation also for me because 3 years ago I was in this show first time and we recorded with Kuba episode about hierarchy of needs in our runner's training, and it was exactly based on hierarchy of endurance training needs pyramid. Yeah, so it was exactly about your work, and yes, it was most listened episode on that year with tens of thousands views. So it was really nice, and I want to ask first question about pyramid, but maybe also about endurance training. We all evolve with time, across the time, and I think if you see any differences, would you change anything in the order of pyramid right now? Something new?
That's a great question. To be honest, I don't think I would. The only thing I would maybe try to emphasize is what I tried to emphasize here, and that is that strength training is not on that hierarchy, but that doesn't mean it doesn't matter. It's just that how much it matters depends on a number of things, such as the specific sport, but also the individual. We've seen great athletes that have won gold medals, set world records, that have never been in a weight room. And we've seen others that say, if I hadn't been in the weight room, I would have never made it. So there's a lot of variation there. And that's why it's not part of that hierarchy. It's just because in a hierarchy, I felt like this was true for basically all endurance sports. Whereas strength training, you need to really understand the sport to get the strength training part right. Does that make sense?
Yes. About strength training, it is the truth. But for endurance athletes, anything else should be different than on this pyramid.
Well, maybe if I could put in, don't be afraid of rest days, in the hierarchy. Trust the value of rest. And that's hard because endurance athletes tend to have a mentality. They tend to be process oriented. They tend to be very good at consistency. They want to train every day. And they also have a FOMO. They're afraid of not training. And so maybe that would be the thing that I would say to them is don't be afraid to have a rest day. In fact, rest days can be a huge benefit for you. And if it's regular folks that have real jobs and real families, then rest days can have a double benefit. Not only you rest, not only for the physiological recovery, but what do? You give yourself some time that day to be mom or be dad, pay bills, do some other things that reduce your stress load. So it's a win-win. And then you come back the next day and you're fresher. Make sense? And if I could squeeze that into the hierarchy, maybe that's what I would try to do is say, don't be afraid of rest days. They can be your quiet superpower.
Even on high level sport.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. They know when they need to rest.
So, Professor, you said that you won't change anything in the pyramid, but looking at the long history of coaching practice and researches, scientific, what percentage of the endurance training methodology you consider to be settled science, and how much is still open for an innovation or change?
Well, it's hard to put a number to it, but it kind of goes through that. I do think that we kind of have a pretty good understanding of the basic picture, like I described, that you can't go hard every day, that we also know biologically that the different signals, I'm going to talk about this tomorrow here, that's not going to help the people listening now, but I'm going to talk about the fact that our biology is such that we have these different signals that happen metabolically during exercise that have been turned into signals for adaptation. And they include signals that are amplified by intensity, but also by duration. Like calcium concentration inside the muscle turns on certain signals. That's a function of just doing a lot of work, a long workout. Whereas the energy charge, the ratio of ATP to AMP, which is, related to high intensity, that's another signal. But all of these signals turn on the same central regulator. So in other words, there's nothing magical about the zones. It's not like zone 1 does this very specific thing and zone 3 does this very specific thing. It's not true. It doesn't work that way. And if we understand that, then what we find, and I'll say tomorrow is that, so you're getting a sneak preview, is that the zones end up being a tool for managing stress. It's not like we're trying to very specifically say this is a capillary building day and this is a heart muscle building day. It does not work that way. But what does happen is that we can regulate systemic stress and keep the athlete managed so that they stay healthy, they stay motivated, they recover, and then they get lots of workouts in a row where they're able to execute, and then good things happen.
And what about distribution for different kind of athletes, like high performance athletes and amateur? Your name is associated with the rule of 80-20, and it should be differ to amateur with 6 to 8 hours for training, and differ with high performance athletes with 20 hours training week.
I would say that all the way down to 6-7 hours a week, how you organize it matters. It makes a difference. And that if all 6-7 hours of those that you have time to do ends up being threshold training, you end up landing in that middle intensity region, you will get fit, but you'll stagnate. You'll reach a plateau pretty fast. And so even for the 6 or 7 hour athlete, I would say, hey, let's see if we can get at least one of your workouts to be longer than normal. Let's use the duration lever that we have. more effectively. And then let's have another workout that we're really going to push the intensity lever and try to get it right, get a lot of minutes at 90% maybe instead of a few minutes at 95%. So we're going to try to control that better and use the 6 or 7 hours a little smarter. And that we can do for most people, because often the busy recreational athlete, the busy, age grouper, as we call them, they have time for those 6 or 7, and they'll tend to just put them all in that, middle zone, right? So that can still get better. Now, if they're only training 3 days a week or 3 hours a week, right?
Pretty small amount of hours for endurance sports, any endurance sports probably.
That's a pretty low amount. Then they can probably get away with just about anything. They're still going to stagnate, but it's very hard to get overtrained or, really do something damaging to yourself on 3 days a week, just because you do have these recovery days in between. It's just that you won't get, you will only get so much better, and then you'll flatten out. And there will be people that say, well, I don't care. That's fine for me. I just want to do my 3 days a week. And I say, that's fine. That's okay. But if you say, I'd like to run faster in the 10K, then you're probably going to have to make a change. You're going to maybe have to add an extra day a week, right? But in that 4 or 5 day a week, 6 or 7 hours, I still believe there's some room for improvement. But you just have to tweak. You get a little bit more duration on one workout. You get a smarter use of intervals on the other. And then in the middle, you do a reasonable endurance session or two. So all the way down to 6 or 7 hours, I think the polarized idea still works.
So how about spending time in zone 1? We all agree that it is important in endurance training. But I was wondering, where is the tripping point when adding some more time in zone 1 turns into, junkie miles?
Yeah, what do we mean by junk miles? It's another term that has been thrown out there that is, it's usually thrown out there by people who like interval training. So all I know is that good athletes, when they do long runs or long rides, they're not junk rides. They're not junk runs. They are part of a process, part of a patient process, and knowing what their long game is. Cadell Evans was a Tour de France winner back some years ago from down under. And the story goes that at a training camp, some young athletes on the same team, this was January, early February, and they were doing some hill repeats. And Cadell just wasn't pushing it very hard. And the youngsters were like, he's the Tour de France winner. Why is he not pushing hard? And so they said, well, I don't want to ask him. You ask him. I don't want to ask him. You ask him. And then finally one of these youngsters said, I'll go ask him. And so he said, hey, mate, why are you doing these intervals so kind of, pretty a little bit lazy? Or, he says, well, mate, I'm competing in the Tour de France in July. It's January. Now's not the time for me to be at my peak. I'm pacing myself, and so that understanding that it's a long game, that he's doing the work, he's building the engine, but he's not going to go over the cliff, not in January, not in February. And that was what he was trying to teach these youngsters I have a rhythm. I'm moving towards a peak where I will have to give everything I have in July, but I'm not going to do it now. Now's not the time. So this is part of the mentality of endurance, is understanding the long game, understanding that you're playing chess, not checkers. Does that make sense? Yeah.
You are also associated with polarized training concept. Now we can see, especially on Scandinavian countries, that most popular idea or trend or hype in their trainings are about threshold training. And if we look at the zones, it looks like this is the territory which you describe as this middle zone for them. What do you think about this methodology it's better for certain type of athletes, or one is better for, I don't know, professional runners and another.
Yeah, well, I think it goes back to that thing, what I said earlier, is that what are we polarizing? We're not polarizing intensity, we're polarizing stress. And a threshold session or a high-intensity interval session are both stressful, but the time course is a little different. You can do more work, but you still end up, as I showed with like heart rate variability, recovery, and so forth. A tough threshold session is just as hard on the body. You turn on the sympathetic nervous system, it's still a high stress. So it's more about how are you manipulating. It may be that like the Ingebrigtsens have made popular the double threshold, and they maybe got it from Marius Bakken.
In our area, this is most popular topic right now on podcasts.
Right. My daughter is a master's student in sports science. She's doing an intervention study on double thresholds. It's a really big study and a huge interest from runner's world and everything. But yeah, so it's popular. But what were they really achieving with double thresholds? It's basically a polarized model, because what they said is what they want to achieve is, hey, if I can do 2 threshold sessions in the same day, double threshold, with some rest in between, and each of those, let's say each of those is 50 minutes. I'm just making up a number. 50 minutes worth of threshold times 2, that's 100 minutes. And now instead of doing one longer threshold that lasted 75 minutes, so they're saying I can get more total signal, more training, but I'm doing both sessions on the same day. Now, what does that do? Well, now this day is tough. This is a hard day, but now I can go easy the next day and the day after that. So they are still using a polarized model, but it's how are they applying the stress? Is it with 2 threshold sessions? Is it with high intensity intervals? Because remember, if you stay at that threshold power long enough, if you do enough repeats of 400 meters, you're going to end up in the red zone, right? It's a sliding scale. So threshold zone 3 will go to zone 4. So it's shades of gray. And so my point is that, all right, if I'm a marathoner, it may be that I choose, because race pace is going to be something close to LT1, it may be that my race pace training is a threshold session, not a high intensity interval session. So we have to understand who are we training and what is the nature of their race. Now, if they're a cyclist that is a puncheur, that is going to be training for Paris-Roubaix, where they've got to come into every cobble segment full guns, well, then they've got to tolerate these really high intensity surges. Well, they're going to train differently. Their hard day will tend to not be a threshold session, but it'll be a repeat surge session, right? So there's different ways of doing hard, right? And one of those ways is double threshold. But what the Ingebrigtsens I think were really smart about was they realized that, hey, let's say they did a 1,500 meter race on the track. So what do? They warm up, long warm up, because short race, long warm up. And then they do the 1,500, so they definitely turn on their stress response because it's a full guns 1,500 meter. But it's still not a lot of signal for adaptation. So then they would, after everybody left, they would continue and do an interval session that day, because they said, well, we've already turned on this response, so let's get more out of it. While it's already a hard day, so let's make it good. And then we can keep the structure so that we keep that polarized model going, the easy is easy the next day. So again, if you really understand what they're doing, it was smart, but it was just they were manipulating how they achieved hard. And sometimes they said it's better to go extra hard on a hard day and then have more recovery.
Yeah, I think that most people also don't realize how fast pace is threshold for them, for these runners like Ingebrigtsen. But mechanically, this is totally different stress than threshold for random age grouper.
And the other thing is they use the term double threshold based on lactate, but it's based on speed. He was way above his threshold because he was doing repeat 400 meters. So each 400 was at a speed higher than his threshold. But because he's getting the recovery time in between, the lactate would stabilize at around 3 millimolar instead of inching up. Whereas if he were to just hold that 400 meter speed, and just keep going, then his lactate would have gone up. My daughter, when she joined Chalva, a good team up in Oslo, which was primarily female athletes, they were trying to do the Ingebrigtsen model. And at first it worked. Her lactates were coming down during those repeat sessions, but then she got hurt because it was too much mechanical load. The change in mechanical load, she wasn't ready for it. And she had a femur injury. It didn't break, but she had to take 6 weeks off because the mechanical load was too much for her. And she said, Papa, there were so many other females that had the same thing happen because it was too big of a jump, 40 times or 20 times 400 meters, going from 10 times 400 to 20 was a big change. And a lot of the athletes got hurt. So we have to be careful about doing what some star athlete does when we don't have the background they do. When Ingebrigtsen Jakob has been doing interval sessions like that since he was 12 or maybe even younger. So his body was prepared for that loading in a different way than my daughter, who just suddenly starts doing it at age 21, right? Or 23 or what. So we got to be careful trying to imitate the big stars because we haven't done what they've done to be able to get there.
Witam w Urzędzie do Spraw Rekordów Życiowych. Następny proszę. Imię, nazwisko. I chcesz złamać 3 godziny w maratonie, tak? Już sprawdzamy. Widzę, że słuchasz RacePace. To dobrze rokuje, ale w aktach brakuje mi potwierdzenia subskrypcji na Patronite. Bez tego nie mogę podpisać Ci zgody. Może najwyżej zgodę na brak kolki na 10 kilometrze. Chcesz prawdziwego progresu? No to musisz zasilić fundusz operacyjny redakcji, wejdź na Patronite, załącz potwierdzenie i wtedy porozmawiamy o Twoich życiówkach. Następny!
Professor, you as a scientist, you've been using some sensors for a long time. How do you see this? That's now every average runner has access to all the technology to, for example, lactate sensors or continuous glucose monitors. Do you consider as a chance or as a danger for us, like average runners, because we can lose ability to read our bodies and
right? Oh, it's a really good question. What I find, I know quite a few elite performers, and when I talk to them, what I find is they use a few technologies very well, but they don't jump on every new thing. They don't jump on the continuous glucose or the core the temperature gauge or what temperature measure. They find they say, hey, I understand heart rate. I do lactate twice a year. I listen to my body, and they have their heads up display. Now, you know what I mean by that? The HUD. If you're a fighter pilot and you're flying one of these jets that can go at the speed, 2 times the speed of sound, you have to keep your eyes up or you'll fly into a mountain really fast. But at the same time, you need some other information. And there's all kinds of instruments in one of those fighter jets. Lots of stuff. But they can't be looking down at all of those instruments all the time or else they'll crash. So how do you do both? Well, they have what's called the heads-up display. So now they're looking forward. They're able to keep their eyes on the prize. Where are they? But there's some numbers that show up on their visor. And it might be fuel, it might be pitch of the plane or elevation, some very critical information. And that's what they need, is what are the most important variables. Well, athletes need the same. They need to figure out what's my heads-up display. Is it heart rate plus RPE plus power? Okay. Is it, but it can't be 10 things.
Yeah.
And it can't be, EMG and muscle oxygenation and course, glucose, and it'll be a bunch of things, and a lot of them are noisy signals, and they don't always make sense. And then the athlete gets confused.
So less is better sometimes.
Less is more. That's what athletes will say. Now, scientists like me, we love all kinds of variables, because that makes our job fun. But we have to be good if I'm going to be useful for a team or for an athlete, I have to put away all that and give them something they can use. And say, look, out of everything I see, the one key thing I see is that your high intensity interval sessions, you're pushing a bit too hard. You're going into zone 5. Let's back it off, keep it in zone 4. That's what happened with my own daughter. She raced every interval session. She just was so competitive. So that when I prescribed to her something like 4 times 8 minutes on the treadmill, which should have put her in zone 4, she'd go into zone 5 because she would just hammer it. And it says, eventually I just, all right, Siren, you don't get to go as hard as you can. You get to go 90%. And that's your limit for that session. Right? And then 2 or 3 weeks of that, she said, oh, Papa, now I'm in flow. She used that term because now she was recovering. She was getting the effects, zone 4, lots of minutes, but she wasn't going so hard. She wasn't digging so deep that she couldn't recover the next day. Because then she was losing some of the quality of her other workouts because she went too hard. So these are the little subtleties. And that's just one small change, but it has a big effect. It's helping the athlete. Often you often end up helping them to understand they don't need to go too hard. It's often, that's the mistake. It's not that they don't go hard enough. It's that they go too hard too often. They don't trust taking rest days. So you have to be the second opinion that gives them the license to do what they know they need. Like my daughter, she'd say, Papa, I think maybe, possibly, I need a rest day. And I said, if you're even asking me, even suggesting, then of course you need a rest day because you never say that unless you're already about to fall off a cliff. So that's, you got to understand your athlete and read their signals, and often they're just asking for permission to do what they know they need to do, which is rest or something like that, So you have to be that second opinion that helps them trust themselves.
I need to ask here about one specific question because you thought that rest days are important and athletes and coaches sometimes are afraid about this. And do you think that it's better than, for example, active recovery sessions for endurance athletes? What do you think?
In my brain, I was already going there. So yeah, this idea of a active recovery day, there's no science to support it. There's no evidence to show that going out on a bike for 2 hours on a day that needs to be a recovery day, and you're saying, well, it's active rest, that's better for you than sitting on the sofa and saying, yeah, I'm going to really rest today. I'm going to actually rest. Now, here's one. Here's what happens is they will often say, well, if I do a rest day, then if I'm going to do intervals the next day, they don't feel good. Well, it's because they don't do a proper warm-up. But if they go through the gears, if they do a proper warm-up, then after a rest day, then we generally see that, yeah, the interval session, if that was the plan, rest day, interval session, that the interval session goes fine, but you've got to warm up, you've got to go through the gears. You can't just do a light warm-up and then go straight to intervals after a rest day, because then it often doesn't feel right, But it's just because they're not turning on the gears. And that's what I've learned from coach of Visma. They say, oh, that's not true. Rest days don't have to be a problem, but you got to go through the gears. You got to invest in the warm-up.
It's a big problem in swimming world, for example. After one day of rest day, they don't feel water. You know what I mean?
Oh my gosh. Yeah, I tell those people, they're just arrogant. They think, the swimmers just think that their technique is so fancy and so critical that if they're gone one day from the water, everything falls apart. That's just silly. It's silly. I mean, and I've said it to him. I said, you think you're the only athletes that have actually a technique? You don't think speed skaters going around a turn at 50 kilometers an hour have technique? You don't think rowers that are rowing, the way the precision is to the centimeter of blade entry and blade, do you think they don't have technique? What are you arrogant goofball. So you can leave the water for a day or two and your technique's not going to fall apart. That's just silly. And in fact, we had a natural experiment. When was that? Corona. During the Corona, what group of athletes was probably the most affected in terms of not being able to do their thing? Swimmers. The swimmers couldn't get in the water because everything was shut down. And I remember having a coach of Stanford's ask me about this. And I said, look, yeah, right now you're not got the water, but don't worry because the motor memory, your technique is dialed in your brain. If you're rusty, it'll be for a few days and it'll be back. Trust me, don't worry. But what you need to do is maintain your rhythm of training. If they were used to getting up early every morning and training, they should keep doing that. Keep the rhythm, keep doing it. If they can do some upper body work, I said, hey, maybe use a Concept 2 ski pulling machine to get some upper body work. But don't worry, the technique is in your brain. It's wired. It's hardwired because your athletes have done tens of thousands of repetitions. So you're going to be fine. And they were. They came back and swimming results just went right back.
It's also positive information probably for injured athletes because they are afraid also after 1 week of, break.
You have to remember that those repetitions that we've done have changed our brains. We have built motor pathways, these pathways in the cerebellum. I'll tell you a story. This is how you know this is true. We learn technique and through it, we have different parts of the brain that have maps of our bodies, but we also have the cerebellum, which is back here in the back of the brain that is responsible for fine-tuning of motor control, of technical control. Well, it is so robust it takes longer to develop these pathways than it does to develop like remembering a telephone number. But once we've learned that technique, it is extremely robust, meaning it's resistant to losing it. Even dementia patients, they can still ride a bicycle. They can't remember their own phone number. They can't remember where they were yesterday or if they've had breakfast today, but they can ride a bicycle. So that motor pathway has not gone away. They can still dance swing if they could before. And if they're a musician, there's a great example. There's a wonderful example of Carlos Santana. Have you heard of Carlos Santana? One of the greatest guitarists ever. Well, when he was 23 years old, he was a West Coast musician. He had a band, and he got invited to Woodstock, right? Which was on a farm up in upstate New York, right? There ended up being 400,000 people at that event. But he flew in early, and he's out there on this farm, and he's got like 10 hours before he goes on. And he's like, what the heck am I going to do? A guy named Garcia from the Grateful Dead said, I'll help you out here. And he gave him some LSD, acid. So he gets high. And this is all his own, he's reported this himself. He says, yeah, I got high on LSD. And then now they need to go out on the stage, and he's still high. And he says, I'm not only high, I'm hallucinating. He says, the guitar, the stalk of the guitar, the neck of the guitar, I was seeing snakes. He was like, and I got to go out on stage. So he said, I just had to close my eyes and trust my fingers, meaning the technique was here. He didn't even have to think about it. It was in his fingers. And he just nailed it. He had an amazing solo, and his career takes off. Why? Because of the fact that these technical motor memories, they are very resilient. You can get high, you can get dement, you can get drunk. Well, not drunk maybe, but you can do a lot of things. You can get old, and they're still there. So you can handle 2 days off.
I'm surprised that LSD and Santana, it's going to be connected with this topic, but
I'm not making this up. He said it himself. I mean, he's been interviewed and he said, yeah, I was hallucinating.
Thank you, Professor, for your time. It was an honor for us to have you here in our podcast, so thank you very much.
Oh, my pleasure.
To była rozmowa z profesorem Stephenem Seilerem. Mam nadzieję, że kilkadziesiąt minut od fundamentów hierarchii potrzeb przez mądre zarządzanie polaryzacją, aż po taką lekcję o tym, jak nasza technika i pamięć ruchowa zostają z nami na lata, o ile tylko oczywiście damy sobie czas na regenerację, że to rzuciło nowe światło lub chociaż upewniło Was w tym, co robicie sami lub ze swoimi podopiecznymi w treningu. To, co przed chwilą usłyszeliście, to nie są przypadkowe rady wyczytane w sieci. To jest naprawdę wiedza oparta na dekadach badań, na tysiącach przeanalizowanych plików treningowych i na ogromnym doświadczeniu, zarówno akademickim, jak i praktycznym. Te przykłady, słuchajcie, były rzucane na konferencji. Nie było Was tam, więc musicie uwierzyć mi na słowo, ale CV, współprac profesora naprawdę wyrywa z kapci. Dlaczego w ogóle o tym wspominam? Żyjemy teraz w takich specyficznych czasach, w dobie wszechobecnego szumu informacyjnego, influencerów, agresywnej komercjalizacji sportu i informacji o nim. I wydaje mi się, że każdy szuka teraz magicznej pigułki lub rewolucyjnego sposobu na sukces w 2 tygodnie, a taka właśnie rzetelna, spokojna i sprawdzona wiedza staje się towarem deficytowym. My w RaceSpace od początku stawiamy na fundamenty i na takie naukowe podstawy. Chcemy, aby polska scena biegowa i ogólnie wytrzymałościowa rosła w oparciu o fakty, a nie o chwilowe trendy. No i tutaj mam do Was ogromną prośbę. Jeżeli Wy również uważacie, że to, co mówi profesor Seiler, jest wartościowe i że może pomóc innym trenować mądrzej, trenować zdrowiej, pomóżcie nam po prostu w propagowaniu tej rzetelnej wiedzy. Algorytmy mediów społecznościowych bywają tutaj bezlitosne dla długich, dla merytorycznych treści, dlatego każde Wasze udostępnienie tego odcinka, każda ocena w aplikacji podcastowej czy komentarz mają naprawdę gigantyczne znaczenie. Jeżeli możecie, to prześlijcie ten odcinek albo znajomemu z biegowej ścieżki, udostępnijcie go w mediach społecznościowych, niech ten głos rozsądku i nauki dotrze po prostu do jak najszerszego grona odbiorców. Pomóżcie nam sprawić, by jakość i merytoryka wygrywały z tym informacyjnym szumem. Bardzo Wam za to dziękuję. Dziękuję, że jesteście z nami i do usłyszenia w kolejnym odcinku RaceSpace. Cześć!